She hid in the wrong car during a storm. 9 months later, she's carrying the Mafia boss's Heir. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. On a dark and rainy night in New York City, Maria was speeding down the slick streets, the storm pounding against the car like an angry beast. The headlights of her old, battered car barely cut through the heavy downpour as she gripped the wheel tighter, her heart racing with a mix of fear and frustration. She had to get home. She had to get away from the mess that was her life. Her recent breakup with her boyfriend had left her emotionally drained, and her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The traffic was terrible, and she had lost track of the time as the storm worsened. All she wanted was to find shelter, and fast. As she drove through the streets, she saw an SUV parked on the side, its engine running, and its lights off. A perfect place to stop and wait out the storm. Without a second thought, she pulled her car over and hurried to the SUV, thinking it was just another parked vehicle. She opened the passenger door and climbed inside, hoping to find some relief from the rain. The interior smelled of leather and expensive cologne, a sharp contrast to the damp air she had just escaped. She didn't notice the man sitting in the driver's seat until she heard the soft click of a door closing. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned to face him. He was tall, sharply dressed, and his presence alone made her feel small. He stared at her with eyes as cold as ice, his gaze making her blood run cold. She quickly muttered an apology, ready to scramble out of the car, but the man stopped her with a single word. Stay. The word hung in the air, as if it carried more weight than just a simple command. The man's tone was calm, but it sent shivers down her spine. Maria hesitated, unsure of what to do. The storm outside raged on, and she could feel the tension building between them. She didn't know who this man was, but something about him made her feel uneasy, as if she had made a dangerous mistake. The man looked at her with a piercing gaze, his jaw tightening as he studied her. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and commanding. Maria's heart raced as she realized she was trapped in the car with a man who clearly wasn't just an ordinary person. The air around them thickened with an unspoken tension. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Why was this man telling her she couldn't leave? Who was he? Her thoughts were interrupted as the man's phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it without taking his eyes off her. I'll be back, he said, more to himself than to her. Maria sat frozen, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. The storm outside continued to howl, but the silence inside the car was deafening. Who was this man, and why had he chosen to bring her into his world? As the rain continued to pound relentlessly against the SUV's windows, Maria sat in the passenger seat, her eyes darting nervously between the man behind the wheel and the rain-soaked streets outside. The tension in the air felt thick, as though every passing moment added another layer of unease. She couldn't quite explain why, but she knew, deep down, that she had just made a dangerous mistake. The man was still staring at her, his gaze unblinking, studying her every move. He hadn't said a word since his simple command to stay, but the way he held himself, the authority he exuded, made it clear that he was not someone she could easily defy. The silence between them felt suffocating, and Maria struggled to think clearly. Who was this man? Why had he brought her into his car? And more importantly, why was she still sitting there, unable to move, unable to leave? She wanted to scream at him to let her go, to get out of the car and run, but something about his presence kept her rooted in place, as though she were a puppet, and he was holding the strings. You're not like the others, the man finally spoke, his voice low, almost too calm, as if he already knew the answer. Maria's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice shaky. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes never leaving hers. You didn't come here by accident, Maria, he said, his tone making her blood run cold. I know exactly who you are. She froze. How did he know her name? Her mind raced as she tried to piece together any possible explanation. She had never seen this man before in her life. Had he been following her? Had he known about her every move? Her heart raced in her chest as the realization hit her. She was in deep. This was no ordinary man, no chance encounter. This was a man with power, with connections, and now she was in his world. "How do you know my name?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately, instead reaching for his phone, a sleek black device that seemed out of place in the dimly lit car. He tapped a few buttons and handed it to her. The screen lit up with a photo of her, taken recently, standing outside her apartment building. Her breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaky with fear. The man didn't answer, but the way his lips curled into a slight smirk told her everything she needed to know. He was enjoying the fear he saw in her eyes. "I'm someone who can protect you," he finally said, his voice cold, almost detached. "But I can also destroy you, Maria. You need to understand that." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man turned his gaze back to the road, as though dismissing her question. "I need you to stay," he said simply. "Stay with me, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. I'll keep you safe. But if you try to leave, well, that would be a mistake." Maria could hardly breathe. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. She was in a situation she couldn't escape from. She had just stumbled into the world of the Mafia, and this man, this terrifying stranger, was the one pulling the strings. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, but Maria didn't notice anymore. All she could think about was the man next to her, the one who seemed to know everything about her life, and the promise of danger that hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. "So, what's it going to be, Maria?" the man asked, his voice almost too casual, as if he was asking her to make a simple decision. "You stay, and I'll make sure nothing bad ever happens to you. You leave, and I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." Maria's heart raced as she tried to process everything. She was terrified, but a part of her, some deep, hidden part of her, knew that she had no choice. She was in his world now, and there was no turning back. As the days passed, Maria found herself trapped in a world she could neither understand nor escape. The man, whom she still knew little about, had made it clear she was now under his protection, or rather, his control. His name was Adrian Moretti, a man whose presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere around him. The mansion he had taken her to was as imposing as it was luxurious, a place where marble floors gleamed with opulence, and the air smelled faintly of leather and something expensive. She had tried to leave several times, but every attempt had been thwarted, not with violence, but with calm assurance. Adrian always seemed to be one step ahead, knowing exactly what she was about to do before she even thought of it. It was as if he controlled every aspect of her life now. At first, Maria had felt a sense of relief. The danger she had been running from seemed far behind her, but it didn't take long for the unease to set in. Adrian's cold demeanor and the way he looked at her, like a possession rather than a person, began to gnaw at her. Every conversation they had felt more like a game of cat and mouse, with Adrian always in control, always leading her along a path she had no say in. "You're safe here," he had told her, but the words felt empty. The mansion was beautiful, but it was suffocating, as if its very walls were closing in on her. One evening, as she sat in the expansive living room, a glass of wine in her hand, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The servants were always around, moving silently through the halls, keeping their distance, but never truly leaving her alone. It was as if her every move was being observed, catalogued, and controlled. She set the glass down, her fingers trembling. "You look lost in thought." Adrian's voice broke through her reverie. He had appeared without her hearing him, as he always did. He moved with a quiet, almost predatory grace. "Is something wrong?" She turned to face him, her heart pounding. She had never felt so vulnerable. "I want to leave," she whispered, the words tasting foreign in her mouth. Adrian's expression darkened, but he didn't speak for a moment. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You don't want to leave," he said, his tone almost coaxing. "You just need time to adjust." Time to adjust? Adjust to what? To this gilded cage he had locked her in? She stared at him, searching for any hint of sincerity, but all she saw was the cold, calculating man who had taken her life and twisted it into something unrecognizable. "I don't belong here," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw tightening. You belong with me, Maria, he replied. You've been mine since the moment you stepped into that car. The words sent a chill down her spine. She had been his the moment she had stepped into that car? The moment she had hidden from the storm, seeking refuge in the wrong place? A part of her wanted to argue, wanted to scream that she wasn't anyone's property, that she was a person, not a possession. But something inside her knew that the fight would be futile. Adrian's world was one of power and control, and she had already been swept into it. Days turned into weeks, and Maria's sense of freedom slowly eroded. She had been given everything she could ever want: luxury, comfort, safety. But at what cost? Every move she made, every word she spoke, seemed to bring her further into Adrian's grasp. She had become his prisoner, not by force, but by her own acceptance of the situation. There were moments when she thought she could leave, moments when she considered escaping, but every time she tried, Adrian was there, always watching, always one step ahead. It wasn't just the mansion that held her captive, it was him. Adrian had become a shadow in her life, constantly looming over her, controlling her every decision, every action. It wasn't just that he wanted her. It was as if he needed her, as if she was a piece in a game that he would never let go of. And as much as she hated to admit it, a part of her had started to feel the weight of his influence. It was like a drug, something that seeped into her veins, taking root in her mind, in her heart. She could feel it, deep down, that she was falling into his world, and she didn't know how to stop it. As days turned into weeks, Maria's internal struggle deepened. Adrian's presence in her life was inescapable. His mansion, which at first had seemed like a haven from the chaos she had left behind, now felt like a gilded cage. Every luxury, every comfort was a reminder of her helplessness. She had never felt more trapped. Despite his reassurances, the world she had entered was not one of safety and peace. It was a world built on power, control, and fear. Adrian's gaze followed her every move, his watchful eyes never leaving her, even when he wasn't physically near. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew everything about her, every thought, every desire, every fear. He had made her life his personal project, and there was no room for escape. One afternoon, after spending the day alone in one of the mansion's many lavish rooms, Maria found herself staring out the window, watching the rain fall in steady sheets against the glass. She had stopped counting the days, but it felt like an eternity since she had stepped into that car, since she had hidden from the storm, only to find herself in the storm of Adrian's world. The silence of the room was broken by the soft click of the door opening. Adrian stepped inside, his presence filling the space like a heavy fog. He was dressed in his usual impeccably tailored suit, the sharp lines of his clothing emphasizing his commanding presence. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You're quiet today," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of something darker beneath it. Maria didn't answer immediately. She had grown tired of the constant games, of the manipulation, of the way he spoke to her like she was nothing more than a piece in his plan. But she knew better than to challenge him. She had tried that before, and it had never ended well. "I'm just thinking," she replied finally, her voice flat. Adrian tilted his head slightly, a small smirk playing on his lips. Thinking about what? She hesitated, not sure how to answer. She didn't want to tell him that she was thinking about leaving, about running far away from him and his world. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much she wanted to break free. Instead, she said, "Just wondering how long I'll be here." Adrian's expression shifted, his eyes darkening slightly. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You think you can leave?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Maria's heart raced at the question, but she refused to back down. She had to at least pretend that she still had some control over her life, even if it was just an illusion. "I don't know," she said, her voice steady. "Maybe I just need to find out." Adrian's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of cold calculation. He stepped forward, his presence overwhelming as he reached out to gently brush a lock of hair from her face. "You're not going anywhere, Maria," he said, his voice softer now, but still carrying that same authority. "You're mine. You've been mine since the moment you stepped into that car, and nothing is going to change that." Maria felt the weight of his words sink into her chest, a knot forming in her stomach. She had known this was coming. She had known that there was no escaping him. The realization hit her like a wave crashing against the shore, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a deep sense of hopelessness. There was no escape. No matter how far she ran, no matter how hard she tried, she would never be free from him. Adrian's hand lingered near her face for a moment longer before he pulled away. "You can fight it all you want," he said, his tone almost casual. "But in the end, you'll see that this is where you belong. You belong with me." Maria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She couldn't argue with him. She couldn't deny the truth that had become painfully clear. She was a prisoner, not just of his world, but of her own choices. She had chosen to hide in the wrong car, and now she was paying the price. The storm outside had nothing on the storm inside her. Adrian moved toward the door, but before leaving, he turned back to look at her one last time. "I'll give you time," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. "But remember, Maria, you're mine. And there's no going back from that." As the door closed behind him, Maria was left alone with her thoughts. She stared out the window once more, the rain continuing to pour down in unrelenting sheets, mirroring the turmoil inside her. She had made a mistake, and now she had to live with the consequences. Maria stood by the large windows, watching the rain pour down outside as it seemed to reflect her own inner turmoil. The mansion, once a place of refuge from the storm, now felt like a prison with golden walls. Adrian's words echoed in her mind, leaving her feeling more trapped than ever. "You belong with me. You're mine." The storm outside had nothing on the storm raging within her. The days were starting to blur together. She went through the motions, ate the meals, answered the questions, but it all felt like a performance. Adrian watched her closely, as if waiting for her to break, but she refused to give him the satisfaction. She would find a way out. She had to. The strange part of her, the part she tried to ignore, was that part of her wanted to stay. Adrian was everything she despised, and everything she couldn't seem to escape. He was powerful, commanding, and he could make her feel like she was the center of his universe, yet he never once treated her like a person. She was just another possession to him, another person to control. Her thoughts were interrupted when Adrian entered the room, his footsteps as silent as ever. He had this way of slipping into a room without making a sound, a ghost who always seemed to know where she was, what she was doing, even before she did. "You're thinking too much again," he said, his voice calm as always, but with an undertone of something darker. She didn't look at him, not at first. She didn't want to. It was easier not to face him, easier to pretend he wasn't there, even though she knew that pretending wouldn't make him go away. "Maybe I'm thinking about how long I can stay in this place before I lose myself completely," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian didn't answer at first, and for a brief moment, she thought maybe he hadn't heard her. But when he spoke again, his tone was different, softer, almost thoughtful. "You won't lose yourself. Not if you stop fighting me." The words hit her like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clung to her, like the dampness of the storm that never seemed to end. She could feel him getting closer, could feel his presence in the room like a heavy weight. "I don't need to fight you," she said, turning to face him, her voice stronger now. "I need to find a way out." Adrian's eyes darkened, and he took a step toward her, closing the space between them. "There's no way out, Maria. Not anymore." His voice was quiet, but there was a certainty in it that made her stomach tighten. "You think you can just walk away from me? From everything I've given you? From everything I've done for you?" The room seemed to shrink as he stood there, his presence swallowing up all the air. "You're mine," he said again, his voice almost a whisper, but the command in it was undeniable. "And you'll always be mine." Maria felt a wave of anger rise up in her chest, but she forced it down. She couldn't let him see how much he affected her, how much his control over her life was starting to suffocate her. She didn't want to be his, didn't want to belong to him. She wanted to escape. But as much as she wanted to run, as much as she wanted to break free from this cage, she knew that she couldn't. Adrian had made sure of that. He had taken away every escape route, every chance she had of leaving. He had made sure that her every move, every step, was under his watchful eye. There was nowhere to run. There was no place left to hide. The thought made her stomach churn with a mixture of fear and frustration. She could try to fight him, try to escape, but she knew it would be futile. He had already won. He always did. He always had control. She couldn't win against him. But she couldn't give in to him, either. Not completely. You're wrong, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the fear she felt. I'm not yours. I don't belong to you. Adrian's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped closer, his presence enveloping her, and she could feel the heat radiating from him. You will, he said softly, his voice almost a promise. You'll see, Maria. In time, you'll see that you belong with me. You always have. His words hung in the air like a weight, heavy and suffocating. Maria wanted to argue, wanted to fight back, but she knew there was no point. She was caught in his world now, and no matter how much she hated it, she was a part of it. There was no escape. There was only him. As the days turned into weeks, Maria found herself more and more caught in the web Adrian had woven around her. Despite the grandeur of his mansion, the luxury that surrounded her at every turn, she couldn't shake the feeling of being a prisoner in a gilded cage. The walls, adorned with priceless art, the marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, only served as a constant reminder that she was living in a world that was not her own. She didn't belong here. Adrian's presence was always felt, always looming over her like a dark cloud. No matter where she went, no matter what she did, he was there, watching, waiting. She had tried to carve out some space for herself, to find moments where she could breathe without the suffocating weight of his control, but it was always fleeting. Adrian was always there, always one step ahead of her. He knew what she was thinking before she even had a chance to realize it herself. One evening, as she sat in the lavish dining room, staring at the untouched meal in front of her, she found herself thinking about her life before Adrian, the life she had left behind. The chaos of the storm that had brought her here seemed so distant now, a mere memory, but the reality of her situation had become painfully clear. She was no longer in control of her own life. She had been swept into his world, and there was no way out. The door to the dining room opened softly, and Adrian walked in, his presence filling the room. He was dressed in his usual tailored suit, his movements smooth and confident, like a predator stalking its prey. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. You've been quiet, he said, his voice smooth, almost teasing. Maria didn't look up. She didn't want to look at him, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much he had gotten under her skin. I'm just tired, she replied, her voice flat, betraying none of the frustration she felt inside. Tired of what? Adrian asked, his tone suddenly more serious. He took a step closer, and for a brief moment, Maria felt a flicker of panic. She wanted to run, to escape, but she knew she couldn't. Not anymore. Not with him watching her every move. Tired of being here, she said, finally meeting his gaze. Tired of being stuck in this place. Adrian's eyes darkened slightly, and he leaned in, his presence looming over her. You don't get to be tired, he said, his voice low, almost menacing. You don't get to decide when you've had enough. Not here. Not in my world. Maria's heart skipped a beat as his words sank in. She wanted to argue, to fight back, but she knew it would be useless. Adrian's control over her was absolute. You're mine, Maria, he continued, his voice softening slightly, though the underlying threat remained. And I don't want you to forget that. She wanted to scream, wanted to push him away, but she stayed silent, biting back the words that threatened to spill out. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the table, unable to look him in the eye any longer. Adrian's hand reached out, cupping her chin gently, forcing her to look up at him. You're not leaving me, he said, his voice full of quiet authority. You belong to me, and you'll stay with me, no matter how much you fight it. Maria wanted to say something, to tell him that she would never accept this, that she would never belong to him. But the words died in her throat. What could she say? What could she do? Every escape attempt she had made had been thwarted by him. He had made sure that she would never be able to leave. I'll never be yours, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. You already are, he replied, his tone filled with cold certainty. You just don't realize it yet. Maria swallowed hard, trying to keep the tears at bay. She couldn't let him see her weakness, couldn't let him see how much he had broken her. But deep down, she knew that he was right. She was already his, and there was no way out. As Adrian turned and walked away, Maria was left alone in the silence of the dining room, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The door clicked softly shut behind him, and she was left in the oppressive silence of the mansion. She wanted to scream, to break free, but she knew it was pointless. Adrian had already won. He had taken everything from her, and now she was trapped in his world, with no way to escape. The days seemed to bleed together, each one heavier than the last. Maria moved through them like a ghost, her body present, but her mind always somewhere else. Adrian's presence was a constant, like a shadow that followed her wherever she went, always lurking, always watching. She tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that everything was normal, but it never felt normal. It never felt right. The mansion, once a refuge from her chaotic life, now felt like a cold, empty fortress. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it was a cage nonetheless. Every step she took within its marble halls echoed with the knowledge that she was a prisoner. There was no escape, no place left for her to run. Adrian had made sure of that. Even when he wasn't physically present, his influence was everywhere. It was in the servants who seemed to appear out of nowhere whenever she needed them, in the guards stationed at every corner of the estate, in the way the air seemed to thicken whenever she thought about trying to leave. It was as though Adrian had wrapped the world around her in a tight, unbreakable knot, and she was stuck in the middle of it, unable to breathe. One evening, after dinner, Maria found herself standing by the grand window, looking out at the sprawling grounds. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, casting a dull gray light over everything. It was the same view she had looked at countless times before, but today it felt different. Today, she felt trapped, suffocated by the silence of the house, by the heavy weight of Adrian's gaze that never seemed to leave her. It had been weeks since they had spoken about her place in his world, since he had told her that she belonged to him. She had tried to fight it, tried to push back against him, but each time, he had only tightened his grip. He was always there, always present, always watching. "What are you thinking about?" Adrian's voice broke through her thoughts, sending a shiver down her spine. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. He stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Nothing," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Adrian stepped forward, his presence filling the room like it always did. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, his every movement exuding confidence and control. "I don't believe that," he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I think you're thinking about how to get out of here." Maria swallowed, the knot in her stomach tightening at his words. She didn't know how he did it, how he always seemed to know what she was thinking. It was as if he could read her mind, could see straight through her. "I don't know what you mean," she said, trying to sound nonchalant, but the lie was obvious, even to her. Adrian's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. He took another step closer, his eyes locking onto hers with a calm intensity that sent a chill through her. "You know, Maria," he began, his voice low, almost gentle. "You don't have to fight me. You don't have to pretend you don't belong here. You're mine, and that's not going to change." Maria's heart raced as his words sank in. She wanted to argue, wanted to scream at him that she was not his, that she would never be his. But she knew it would be pointless. Adrian had already won. There was no fighting him, no escaping him. She was caught in his world now, and no matter how much she hated it, she couldn't get out. "I'll never be yours," she said quietly, the words barely escaping her lips. Adrian didn't flinch, didn't react. He simply stepped closer, his gaze softening slightly. "You already are," he said, his voice almost tender. "And the sooner you accept it, the easier it will be for both of us." Maria felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had known, deep down, that this was where she was headed, that this was what Adrian wanted all along. But hearing him say it out loud made it feel so much more real, so much more suffocating. "I'm not a part of your world," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. Adrian's smile faded, replaced by an almost sorrowful look. "You already are, Maria," he said again, his tone heavier now, as though he were trying to convince her of something. "You just don't realize it yet." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek in a gesture that should have felt comforting, but instead felt like a brand, like a mark of ownership. Maria recoiled instinctively, but Adrian's grip was firm, his touch unyielding. "You'll learn," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "In time, you'll learn to accept this. To accept me." Maria wanted to pull away, wanted to break free from his touch, but she didn't. She couldn't. She was caught in his trap, and there was no way out. The thought of it made her feel sick, but she couldn't escape the reality that Adrian had already won. He was right. She belonged to him, and there was nothing she could do to change it. Maria's heart thudded painfully in her chest as Adrian's words echoed in her mind. She belonged to him. The thought felt suffocating, like a weight that pressed down on her from all sides, cutting off her breath, leaving her feeling helpless. Every attempt to fight back, every resistance she had shown, had been useless. Adrian was unyielding, and his control over her life seemed absolute. The more she resisted, the tighter his grip became, until she was left with nothing but his world. The realization gnawed at her insides. There was no escape. She couldn't leave. There was nowhere to go. Adrian had made sure of that. As the days turned into weeks, Maria's once defiant spirit began to wane. She had tried to focus on anything, everything, to distract herself from the reality of her situation. But it was always the same. Adrian was always there, watching her, waiting for her to accept her place in his world. And each time she tried to break free, he was there, always one step ahead. The mansion, with its high ceilings and opulent rooms, became her prison, its grandeur now a reminder of her helplessness. She could no longer find comfort in its beauty. The people who worked for Adrian never looked her in the eye, and the few who did always wore expressions of quiet resignation. They, too, were under his thumb, just like her. She was no different from any of them. One afternoon, as she wandered aimlessly through one of the mansion's many hallways, she found herself stopping in front of a large mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but it felt like someone else. The woman in the mirror looked tired, her once bright eyes now dull and resigned. She had lost something. The spark, the fire that used to burn inside her. What happened to her? How had she allowed herself to be drawn into Adrian's world so completely? The thought made her sick, but there was nothing she could do. She was trapped. She had tried to talk to him about leaving, about regaining control of her life, but each time she did, Adrian only smiled. A small, knowing smile that made her feel smaller and smaller. "You belong to me, Maria," he would say, his voice so calm, so certain. "You always will." The words stung, and she hated herself for not being able to fight back. But what could she do? The mansion, the staff, the endless surveillance, it all worked together to keep her under control. Every move she made, every decision she tried to make, was carefully watched, carefully guided by Adrian's hand. One evening, as she sat alone in the garden, the cool breeze ruffling her hair, Maria couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. She remembered the life she once had, the life before Adrian. It felt like a distant dream now, one she could barely remember. There was a time when she had choices, when she had control over her own life. But that had been taken from her the moment she stepped into Adrian's car, the night of the storm. "Maria," Adrian's voice cut through the stillness of the garden, pulling her from her thoughts. He stepped into the moonlight, his silhouette tall and imposing. She didn't look up, didn't want to face him, but she knew he was there, just as he always was. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone casual, but with an edge she couldn't quite place. She didn't respond, didn't know what to say. What was there left to say? The days of resistance, the days of pretending she had control, were over. She had given in so many ways. "I've been thinking," Adrian continued, stepping closer, "about your future. About what you really want." She glanced up at him, her eyes hardening. "I want to leave," she said, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty she felt inside. Adrian didn't flinch. He didn't seem surprised. He simply stared at her, his gaze unwavering. "I told you before, Maria," he said, his voice soft but with an authority that made her blood run cold. "You're not leaving me. You're mine, and you'll stay with me, whether you want to or not." His words felt like chains tightening around her chest. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but she didn't. She couldn't. There was nowhere to go. Adrian was right. She belonged to him. "You don't get to decide that," she said, the defiance still lingering in her voice, even if it was faint. Adrian smiled, that same, cold smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I already have, Maria," he said, stepping even closer. "I decided the moment you stepped into my world. And now, you'll stay here. With me." Maria's heart sank. She had already known the truth, But hearing it from him made it feel so much more final, so much more real. There was no escape. There was no way out. She was trapped in his world, and there was no one left to fight for her freedom. She had no choice but to accept it. Adrian had won. He always would. The mansion had become both a prison and a strange sanctuary, its beauty now. A constant reminder of Maria's captivity. Adrian's control over her life had tightened even further, and she felt the walls closing in around her with every passing day. Despite the luxury surrounding her, despite the endless supply of everything she could ever want, there was one thing she could never have: freedom. And it gnawed at her day and night. Adrian had always been a step ahead of her, watching her every move, anticipating her every thought. His eyes, cold and calculating, never left her. There was no escape, no place where she could truly be herself. Everything she did was monitored. Every word she spoke seemed to echo back at her, filtered through Adrian's influence. The very air in the mansion felt different, heavy, oppressive. She had tried, at first, to maintain some semblance of her old life, to push against Adrian's hold. She tried to keep to herself, tried to escape into the small moments of privacy she could find. But every time she thought she had gotten away, every time she tried to slip through his fingers, he was there, watching, waiting. Adrian had become a constant in her life, an undeniable force that she couldn't ignore or fight. She had been broken down over time, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the woman who had entered his world so full of hope. She had been replaced by someone else, someone resigned to the life Adrian had designed for her. But deep down, Maria refused to give in completely. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when she would catch a glimpse of her former self, a woman who had once been strong, independent, unyielding. Those moments were brief, but they reminded her that she hadn't given up entirely. She hadn't surrendered all of herself to Adrian. Not yet. One night, after dinner, Maria found herself alone in the garden once more. The cool night air brushed against her skin, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to forget. She looked up at the stars, the vastness of the sky offering a stark contrast to the narrow world she now inhabited. It was the only time she felt free, when she was alone with her thoughts, when the weight of Adrian's presence didn't suffocate her. She had always found peace in the quiet of nature, away from the chaos that surrounded her in the mansion. But her moment of peace was short-lived. She heard footsteps behind her, and she knew without turning around who it was. "Adrian, you're still trying to escape, aren't you?" His voice cut through the stillness like a blade. Maria's heart skipped a beat, but she refused to show any sign of fear. She didn't turn to face him. "No," she said, her voice steady, despite the turmoil inside her. "I'm just thinking." Adrian stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a dark cloud. "Thinking about what, Maria?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning she couldn't ignore. "About my life," she said quietly, still not looking at him. "The life I had before all of this." Adrian's silence was heavy. When he spoke again, his words were sharp, almost too calm. "You think you can go back to that life?" He chuckled softly, the sound sending a chill down her spine. "You're mine now, Maria. You always will be." She closed her eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. She had known, deep down, that there was no going back. She had crossed a line the moment she stepped into his car, and everything had changed after that. There was no escaping him. There was no returning to the life she had once known. "I'm not yours," she said, though the words felt hollow, even to her. Adrian's laugh echoed in the night, dark and cold. "You keep telling yourself that," he said, stepping even closer, his presence overwhelming. "But deep down, you know the truth. You belong to me." Maria wanted to argue, wanted to fight back, but she couldn't find the words. She had tried so hard to maintain some semblance of independence, but in the end, Adrian had worn her down. There was nothing left to fight with. She was lost in his world now, a world where she had no control, no choice. Adrian reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, and she flinched instinctively. He noticed, of course, and his smirk widened. "You can't hide from me," he said softly, his hand sliding down to rest on her shoulder. "You'll never be able to hide from me." Maria turned to face him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in days. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to push him away, but she couldn't. He was too strong, too powerful, and no matter how hard she fought, she knew she would never win. "I'll never accept this," she said, her voice trembling, though she tried to mask it. Adrian's smile never wavered. "It doesn't matter if you accept it, Maria," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've already made your choice. You're mine, and there's nothing you can do to change that." The words stung, but they were the truth. She was his. She always had been, and there was no way out. Maria stood still in the garden, her heart pounding in her chest as Adrian's words sank deeper into her consciousness. She was his, and there was nothing she could do to change that. It wasn't just his control over her physical existence. It was something deeper, something psychological. Every time she thought she could escape, every time she convinced herself that she could regain some control over her life, Adrian would pull her back into his web, gently, but firmly. He was always a step ahead, and she was always a step behind. The weight of his presence was suffocating, and she had no choice but to live within the confines of his world. He had made it clear from the start, there was no leaving. The mansion had become her prison, its gilded walls a stark contrast to the bars she now felt around her. And yet, she found herself staying. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Adrian had taken everything. Her freedom, her independence, her will. But still, there was a small part of her, a part that she kept buried deep inside, that refused to fully surrender. She was broken, but she wasn't completely gone. That small part of her still believed that one day, somehow, she would find a way out. But that day seemed farther and farther away. A few days after their conversation in the garden, Adrian had insisted on taking her to one of his business meetings. It was the first time he had included her in anything related to his empire, and the idea of it filled her with dread. She didn't want to be a part of his world, didn't want to know what went on behind the closed doors of his business dealings. But there was no getting out of it. He told her she would accompany him. The meeting was held in a sleek, modern building in downtown Manhattan, a far cry from the mansion she had come to despise. The moment they stepped inside, the cold, sterile atmosphere of the building overwhelmed her. Men in suits walked past them, their eyes avoiding hers, as if they already knew who she was, what she represented. Adrian led her through the building with the same effortless confidence he always had, his hand on her lower back guiding her. They entered a large conference room, and immediately, Maria felt the weight of the room settle on her. Every person present was someone important, someone powerful, and they all turned to look at her as soon as she entered. She could feel their eyes on her, scrutinizing her every move, but she didn't dare say anything. Adrian didn't acknowledge the glances or the stares. He simply sat at the head of the table and motioned for her to sit beside him. As the meeting began, she tried her best to tune out the conversation. She didn't understand the jargon, didn't want to know what illegal deals were being made behind closed doors. But she could tell by the way Adrian held himself, by the way everyone in the room deferred to him, that he was the one in charge. He wasn't just a man. He was a king, ruling over his kingdom with an iron fist. The meeting dragged on for hours, and by the time they left, Maria felt as though she had been suffocating the entire time. Adrian didn't speak to her much during the drive back to the mansion, but when they arrived, he took her hand and led her to his study. "You see," he said softly, his voice low and controlled, "this is the world you are now a part of. You're not just mine in name, Maria. You are a part of everything I've built. This life, this empire, it's all for you now." Maria didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to scream, to tell him that she didn't want any part of it, that she didn't want his empire, his world. But another part of her, the part that had been worn down by weeks of submission, couldn't bring herself to protest. She was too exhausted, too defeated. She simply nodded, her throat tight. Adrian watched her. For a moment, as if assessing her, then reached for her hand again. "You'll come to understand," he said softly. "In time, you'll see that everything I've done for you." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead in a gesture that felt too intimate for what it was. Maria closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She had wanted so much more for herself. She had wanted to be free, to be someone who made her own choices. But here she was, in the world of a man who controlled everything, including her. She wasn't just trapped in his mansion, she was trapped in his life. And as much as she hated it, as much as she wanted to escape, she knew deep down that there was no way out. Adrian had already won. Maria sat in the quiet of her room, staring out of the large window that overlooked the vast estate. The night had settled in, and the moonlight bathed the garden in an eerie glow. She had come to dread the nights more than the days. It was during the quiet of the night when Adrian's words echoed most strongly in her mind. "You're mine. You belong to me." They replayed over and over, each time making her feel more suffocated, more trapped in his world. She had tried so many times to break free, to tell herself that she still had control over her life. But as time passed, it became harder and harder to convince herself of that. Adrian had slowly, methodically stripped her of everything: her independence, her freedom, her choices. She was no longer the woman who had walked into that storm that night. She was someone else now, someone defined by him, by the world he had trapped her in. Maria's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Adrian. His presence filled the room, a heavy, oppressive force. "I see you're still brooding," he said, his voice low and calm. He was standing by the door, watching her. Maria didn't answer. She couldn't. What was there to say? Every word she spoke felt like a betrayal to herself, like a small piece of her breaking off and slipping away. Adrian stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "You know," he continued, his tone now soft, almost soothing, "you don't have to fight this. You don't have to keep pretending you want to leave." His words were like a dagger to her heart, but she forced herself to stay still. She couldn't show him how much he affected her, how deeply his control had seeped into her soul. "I'm not pretending," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to leave." Adrian's smile never faltered. He was standing in front of her now, his face mere inches from hers. "But you won't," he said, almost as if it were a fact, not a question. "You're here because you know this is where you belong. You're just too scared to admit it." His hand reached up, his fingers gently brushing against her cheek in a way that should have been comforting, but only made her skin crawl. Maria didn't move. She couldn't. She felt frozen in place, trapped by his gaze, by his touch. Adrian's eyes darkened, and he leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "You belong with me, Maria," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "And no matter how much you fight it, you always will." Her heart raced, but she didn't pull away. She had stopped trying to resist. It was easier to simply accept it, to let herself sink into the inevitable. She had already given in to him, hadn't she? She had already become part of his world. But even as she stood there, listening to the calm authority in his voice, a part of her still longed for freedom, for the life she had once known. "Why can't you just let me go?" she asked, her voice trembling. Adrian's gaze softened, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "Because I can't, Maria," he said, his voice low and serious. "You don't understand. You're mine now, and I will never let you go. Not now, not ever." The finality in his words left no room for argument. Maria felt a weight settle in her chest, a deep, suffocating feeling that made it hard to breathe. She had tried to fight, but it was clear now that she had already lost. There was no escaping Adrian, no escaping the life he had built for her. She wasn't just trapped in this mansion. She was trapped in his world, in his life. And there was no way out. Adrian took a step back, his hand still resting lightly on her shoulder. "You'll learn to accept this, Maria," he said, his voice soft but filled with certainty. "You'll learn that this is the only place you're meant to be. You'll see that you belong to me, and there's no escaping that." Maria wanted to scream, to tell him that she would never accept it, that she would never accept him. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she nodded, the small spark of defiance inside her slowly dying out. She had tried to fight it for so long, but she was too tired now. She was too broken. Adrian was right. She belonged to him, and there was no way out. The days in the mansion had blurred into an endless routine. Maria had grown accustomed to Adrian's presence, to his watchful eyes and his constant control over every aspect of her life. At first, she had fought it, tried to maintain some semblance of the life she once had, the life where she made her own choices. But now, the fight felt futile. She was no longer the person she had been when she walked into Adrian's world. She had been changed by the very world she hated, and no matter how much she tried to push back, she couldn't undo what had already been done. Adrian had become an unmovable force, and she had become a prisoner, not just physically, but emotionally as well. She spent her days in the mansion, wandering from one room to another, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She knew it was impossible. There was no way out. Every attempt she had made had been thwarted by Adrian. Every time she thought she could leave, he had stopped her, gently but firmly, with the same cold assurance that had become his trademark. But something was changing inside her. A part of her had started to question everything. The life she was living, the world Adrian had forced her into. It wasn't that she wanted to escape anymore. It was that she wanted control. She wanted to know what it felt like to make a decision, to choose for herself, to be more than just an object in Adrian's world. She had been too passive for too long, too resigned to her fate. But now, the spark that had been buried deep inside her was starting to flare up again. She wasn't sure what she could do with it yet, but she knew it was time to stop waiting for Adrian to decide everything for her. As if he had sensed the shift in her, Adrian had begun to change his behavior toward her. He had started to give her more space, to allow her more freedom within the confines of his world. At first, she had been wary. Was this just another way of tightening his grip, of making her think she had more control when in reality, she didn't? But as the days went on, she started to realize that it wasn't about control anymore. Adrian was changing, too. There was a vulnerability in his actions, a side of him that he hadn't shown before. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but it was there. It was in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, in the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, in the rare moments when his guard slipped. Adrian Moretti, the Mafia boss who had once seemed invincible, was starting to show cracks. And it made Maria wonder if there was more to him than just the man who had trapped her in his world. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, Maria found herself standing in the garden again, just as she had so many times before. But this time, it felt different. There was no looming sense of dread, no feeling of being trapped. Instead, there was a sense of calm, of acceptance. She had spent so many months fighting against everything Adrian had given her, against everything he had made her become. But now, for the first time, she didn't feel the need to fight anymore. She was tired of fighting. She was tired of trying to escape. The world she had been forced into wasn't perfect. It wasn't what she had wanted, but it was hers now. She had learned to live with it, to make her peace with it. And in that moment, she realized something else. She had been waiting for Adrian to change, to soften, to become someone she could trust, someone who could see her as more than just his possession. But she didn't need him to change. She needed to change. She needed to stop looking to him for validation, to stop waiting for him to give her permission to live her life. She had already given up so much of herself to him, but she didn't have to give up everything. She could still choose. She could still take control of her own fate. As she stood there in the garden, the breeze brushing against her skin, Maria made a decision. She wasn't going to let Adrian define her anymore. She wasn't going to let him decide what her life would be. She would live it on her terms. It was time to stop being the victim, to stop waiting for someone else to save her. She was her own salvation. When Adrian found her in the garden later that evening, he looked at her with the same intense gaze, the one that always seemed to hold all the answers. But Maria didn't flinch. She didn't look away. "What are you thinking about?" Adrian asked, his voice soft, almost cautious. Maria turned to face him, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'm thinking about my future," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm thinking about what it's going to look like when I'm the one making the decisions." Adrian studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time since they had met, he nodded. "I think you're finally starting to understand," he said quietly. "You've always had the power, Maria. It was just waiting for you to take it." And in that moment, Maria realized that she had finally broken free, not from Adrian's world, but from the chains she had placed on herself. She had found the strength to live her life on her own terms, and that was the only thing she had ever truly needed. I have just completed a journey into a world where power, control, and emotional intensity collide in a tale of dark romance. The story explores the evolving dynamic between two compelling characters, Maria and Adrian, who navigate a relationship defined by desire, dominance, and the battle for freedom. Set within the luxurious yet suffocating walls of Adrian's mansion, Maria finds herself trapped in a complex relationship with a mafia boss, struggling to break free from his grip while also confronting the dark emotions that develop between them. This dark romance delves deep into the emotional struggles of a woman, caught between her longing for freedom and the undeniable pull of a powerful man who controls every aspect of her life. As Maria wrestles with her feelings for Adrian, she discovers that their connection is more than just a battle for control. It's a fight for her very soul. The tension builds as the lines between love and manipulation blur, and Maria must decide whether to surrender to the dark romance or fight for the life she once knew. Throughout this journey, the stakes become higher, and Maria's transformation is profound. She must learn to reclaim her agency, to stop waiting for someone else to save her, and ultimately, to decide how to navigate her own destiny. This dark romance explores themes of emotional vulnerability, power dynamics, and the complexities of a love story that pushes the boundaries of control and trust. It's a tale that pulls the reader in, keeping them on the edge of their seat as Maria unravels the mysteries of her own heart and the dangerous world she now inhabits. From the first intense moments of their connection to the final moments of self-realization, this dark romance takes readers through a whirlwind of emotions and moral dilemmas that will leave them questioning what truly defines love and power.